There is a void under the left paw of the Great Sphinx, and for 30 years, the Egyptian government has refused to let anyone open it. That is not a legend. It is on a seismograph. It was measured in 1991 by a professional seismologist from Houston, recorded in a peer-reviewed journal, and then quietly walled off from the public. A rectangular space, roughly 25 feet beneath the stone, with edges too straight to be natural. And the official answer to the question everyone asks, the question that probably brought you here, what is inside it, is the same answer it has been for 3 decades. Silence. So let me tell you what is actually down there. Not the fantasy version, the documented version. Because the truth about what sits beneath the Sphinx is stranger than the rumor, and it points to something most historians will not say out loud. The monument we have been staring at for 4,500 years may be sitting on top of something far older, something built by people who came before the Egypt we were taught about in school. And the technology that carved it should not have existed yet. To be clear about what we are dealing with, this is not a guess pulled from thin air. Every claim I am about to walk you through is on the record. A peer-reviewed seismic survey, a geological analysis presented to a convention of professional scientists, radar scans from multiple independent teams across 4 decades. None of it is folklore. All of it is documented, published, and then, in the strangest part of the whole affair, set aside and ignored. The story of the Sphinx is not a story of missing evidence. It is a story of evidence that exists, that points somewhere uncomfortable, and that nobody in a position of authority wants to follow to the end. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly why that paw has never been opened. If you find buried history as unsettling as I do, subscribe before we go further, because this is the kind of story that gets quietly buried. Let me take you back to the object itself. Most people who visit Giza never look down. They look up at the face, they take the photograph, they walk the rope line, and they leave. Most people walk right past the one detail that matters, because the secret of the Sphinx is not in its face. It is in the ground it sits on, and in the rock it is carved from, and in the patterns cut into its body that do not match any weather Egypt has seen in 5,000 years. The Great Sphinx is the largest monolithic statue on Earth. It was carved from a single ridge of limestone, 240 feet long, 66 feet high, the body of a lion, the head of a man. The official story is simple and clean. It was built around 2500 BCE, during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, as a guardian of his pyramid. That is what the textbooks say. That is what the tour guides repeat. For most of the last century, nobody questioned it. But here is the first crack in that story. There is no inscription. Not one. The single most famous monument in the ancient world. A statue the size of a city block, and the people who supposedly built it left no carving, no dedication, no record that says Khafre made this. We attribute it to him by association, because it sits near his pyramid, because a damaged stone tablet placed between its paws over 1,000 years later mentions his name in a broken line. That is the entire foundation of the date everyone treats as fact. Proximity and a guess. Think about how strange that is for a moment. The Egyptians were obsessive record keepers. They inscribed the walls of tombs that no living person would ever see again. They carved the names of pharaohs onto everything they touched, because to be named was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to be immortal. A king who commanded the carving of the largest statue on the planet would have signed it. He would have covered it in his name. And yet the Sphinx is blank. The body is silent. The only name attached to it comes from a slab of granite, the dream stele, that a much later pharaoh wedged between the paws more than 1,000 years after the supposed construction date. On that stele, the syllable that some read as Khafre sits in a damaged, crumbling line. Build an entire chronology on a broken syllable, and the chronology is only as solid as the break. And when a geologist finally looked at the stone itself, not the politics around it, the date fell apart. This is where the story stops being about a statue and starts being about a machine that does not fit the timeline. Because to understand what is wrong with the Sphinx, you have to understand what is wrong with its skin. For a century, Egyptologists explained the deep scarring on the Sphinx's body as wind erosion. Sand, blown across the desert for thousands of years, slowly sanding the stone down. It is a reasonable explanation. It is also, according to the Geology, wrong. In 1990, an author named John Anthony West brought a question to a geologist at Boston University named Dr. Robert Schoch. West had noticed something strange in old photographs. The erosion on the Sphinx did not look like wind damage. Wind, blowing sand horizontally, carves horizontal grooves. It follows the soft layers of the rock and leaves the hard ones standing. It produces a smooth, flat, layered weathering. That is what you see on the nearby tombs that we know are from Khafre's era. Clean, horizontal striations. But the Sphinx does not have that. The Sphinx and the walls of the pit it sits in have deep, vertical channels, rounded, undulating fissures running from top to bottom. The kind of weathering that is produced by one thing and one thing only: water. Heavy, sustained, vertical rainfall running down the stone for centuries, cutting it like rain cuts a hillside. Schoch is not a fringe figure. He holds a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale. And when he examined the stone in person, he agreed. This was water erosion, rain erosion. And that single conclusion detonates the entire timeline. Because here is the problem. The last time the Sahara saw that kind of heavy, prolonged rainfall, the kind that could carve channels 2 feet deep into solid limestone, was not 2500 BCE. The desert was already a desert by then. The last time that region was wet enough to produce this erosion was during a climate window that ended thousands of years earlier. To get this much water damage, the body of the Sphinx had to already be standing and exposed, getting rained on long before Khafre was ever born. Schoch's estimate, conservative, careful, deliberately cautious, put the carving of the Sphinx's core body somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE. Other researchers pushed it further to as far back as 10,000 BCE. And remember what that means. 10,000 BCE is before the wheel, before writing, before what we call civilization is supposed to have existed at all. It would mean the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. It would mean somebody was carving the largest statue on the planet during what we are told was the Stone Age. He presented this in October 1991 at the Geological Society of America convention in San Diego. He did not stand on a stage and shout that Atlantis was real. He sat at a table in a hall full of other scientists and quietly explained the weathering data to anyone who walked by. Around 70 fellow scientists stopped. Many asked to be kept informed. These were not mystics. They were geologists. People who spend their lives reading the language of stone. And they found the rainfall argument credible. That is the part that gets left out of the dismissals. The objection to Schoch did not come from the people who understood erosion. It came from the people who understood Egyptian chronology and who could not afford for it to be wrong. The response from the Egyptology establishment was not a counter-study. It was a sentence. One prominent Egyptologist dismissed the entire geological analysis by saying, "That is just the way the rock weathers. No data, no rebuttal of the rainfall mechanism. Just a wave of the hand." For decades, scholars dismissed the vertical channeling as nothing, and the men who actually measure rock for a living looked at that and went quiet because they knew what they were seeing. That is the first clue. The skin of the monument records a flood of time that is not supposed to exist. And it pairs with something you can see in any photograph, something tourists notice and then talk themselves out of. The head is too small. Look at the proportions. The body is enormous, leonine, sprawling. The head sits on top of it like it belongs to a different statue, because it may. If the original monument was carved thousands of years before the dynastic Egyptians arrived, the head we see today could be a recarving. A later people, finding a colossal weathered lion in the sand, may have reshaped the original animal head into the face of a pharaoh, shrinking it in the process. That would explain the mismatch. It would explain why the head is far less eroded than the body, as if it spent far less time exposed to the rain. The body is ancient. The face is a renovation, a new mask on a forgotten god. Now we get to the second clue, the one that turns a weathered statue into something with rooms inside it. Because Scotch did not come to Egypt alone. He brought a seismologist. In April 1991, a man named Thomas Dobecki traveled to Giza. Dobecki was not a hobbyist. He worked for a respected Houston firm, McBride, Ratcliffe and Associates, the kind of company that maps the ground for oil and engineering projects. He brought professional seismic equipment, the same technology used to find oil deposits and map bedrock, and he aimed it down into the floor of the pit around the Sphinx. What the equipment does is simple to understand. You send sound waves into the rock. Solid rock returns one kind of echo. Empty space returns another. By reading the echoes, you can map what is underground without digging a single hole. Dobecki ran 19 separate seismic profiles around the monument, and the rock was not solid. He expected to map bedrock, plain, dense, uninterrupted limestone, the natural foundation of a 4,500-year-old statue. That is not what came back. The echoes told a different story, and once you know how to read them, the story is unmistakable. The survey, published in the journal Geoarchaeology in 1992, documented a series of cavities. Cavities on the north side of the Sphinx, cavities on the south side, and a cavity directly between its paws. But the one that stopped people cold was the one under the left paw. The seismic data showed a space roughly 25 feet down, and it was not a random crack. It read as rectangular, straight sides, right angles. Nature does not carve right angles deep in the bedrock. Faults are jagged. Erosion is rounded. Natural voids are irregular blobs. A rectangle, a deliberate rectangular chamber sitting under the paw of the oldest monument on Earth, is the signature of a hand, of a tool, of intention. And Dobecki noticed something else in the readings. The weathering of the rock beneath the enclosure floor was not uniform. Different parts of the pit had been exposed to the open air for different lengths of time, which means the ground around the Sphinx was not all dug out at once. It was opened in stages, across what may have been thousands of years. The monument has layers of history buried in the dirt around it, and we have read almost none of them. And there is a detail in the chamber's placement that is hard to wave away. It does not sit randomly. It sits directly under the paw. If you were a culture that wanted to mark a hidden space, to flag it for anyone who came after, where would you put your marker? You would put the largest, most permanent object you could carve directly on top of it. A lion, 240 feet long, is not a subtle thing. It is the most durable signpost ever made, and it points straight down. So now we have a statue that was rained on before the rain stopped, sitting on top of a bedrock honeycombed with cavities, with a rectangular chamber under its paw that no geological process can easily explain. For decades, that was where it stood, a measurement on a graph, a void that everyone knew about and nobody could open. Then the technology got better, and that is the third clue, the one that finally let people see the shape of what is down there. Modern survey teams have come back to Giza with tools Dobecki could only dream of. Ground-penetrating radar, far more sensitive than what existed in 1991. And newer still, synthetic aperture radar, a technology that reads micro-vibrations in the ground to build a picture of what sits below, with no drilling at all. The newest scans did not erase the old anomaly. They sharpened it, They confirmed a distinct void beneath the Sphinx's front paws. Not a fuzzy smear this time, a structured cavity with clear boundaries. A space with walls, and around the wider Giza plateau, the same scanning technology has lit up other anomalies that nobody can explain. An L-shaped structure buried in the nearby cemetery, a geometric feature with edges far too regular to be natural, sitting under the sand where no excavation has reached. Strange voids, patterned shapes, straight lines underground where there should be nothing but rock and rubble. The Sphinx, remember, is carved from a single ridge of limestone. It is not built from blocks stacked on a foundation. It is subtractive. The sculptors started with a hill of solid rock and cut everything away that was not the lion, which makes the cavities underneath even harder to explain. You do not get clean rectangular rooms appearing by accident inside a hill that someone shaped from the outside. Either the chamber was already there, a natural pocket the builders knew about, or it was deliberately hollowed out before, during, or after the carving. Every one of those options means somebody was working below the surface, in the dark, inside the bedrock, with purpose. So the question the radar forces on us is brutal and simple. Is that chamber under the paw a natural pocket in the stone, or did someone carve it on purpose and then seal it and then build a lion the size of a battleship on top of it to mark the spot? That is the question that has never been answered. And the reason it has never been answered is the part of this story that should make you uncomfortable. Because every single time someone gets close, the door closes. The pattern goes back almost a century. In the 1920s and 30s, a French engineer named Émile Barrès spent years excavating around the Sphinx. He reportedly found and explored passages beneath the statue. Much of his documentation is scattered, incomplete, or simply lost. In 1987, a Japanese team from Waseda University in Tokyo ran an electromagnetic survey and reported evidence of a tunnel running north to south under the monument, plus a water pocket and another cavity near the hind paws. Their work was never followed to its conclusion. Then came the Scotch and Dobecki survey in 1991, which mapped the rectangular chamber. And then, in 1996, a team from Florida State University and Boston University brought ground-penetrating radar back into the enclosure. Most tourists assumed they were doing routine maintenance. They were not. They were mapping the void again, confirming it again, and in that same period, footage surfaced that appeared to show a tunnel entrance near the Sphinx. It drew immediate attention, and then it was quietly retracted, never fully explained, never publicly examined in detail, acknowledged and then gone. No official excavation has ever been allowed to enter the chamber under the left paw. Boreholes were drilled nearby decades ago, but the specific rectangular void, the one on every scan from 1991 to today, remains sealed. The reason given by Egyptian authorities is always the same: preservation. The limestone is fragile. Drilling could destabilize the monument. And on its face, that is a reasonable concern. But here is the problem with that explanation. The site was sealed. It was mapped. And then it disappeared from the conversation. We have the coordinates. We have the depth. We have the shape. We have, in some cases, the radar imagery showing wall-like boundaries. We have had the technology to look without harming a single stone for over 30 years. And the answer is still no. Not yet. Not now. Wait, when a chamber is that well documented and that completely off limits for that long, the preservation argument starts to wear thin. You begin to wonder if the concern is the stone, or if the concern is what the stone is hiding. And there is a name that hangs over this whole site, a name the establishment hates, but one that will not go away: the Hall of Records. The idea, popularized decades ago, that beneath the Sphinx lies a sealed archive, a library of a lost age, the collected knowledge of a civilization that vanished. Most serious researchers roll their eyes at the phrase, and for good reason. It started as a vision, a claim with no evidence behind it. But strip away the mysticism and look at what the science left us with. A documented rectangular void, a network of cavities, a monument older than its own civilization, a century of expeditions that kept finding tunnels and kept getting shut down. You do not need a prophet to find that combination unsettling. The hard data alone is enough. The legend may be nonsense, the hole in the ground is not. So let me slow down here, because this is the moment where I have to be honest with you. Now, does any of this prove that there is a chamber of lost super technology under the Sphinx, left behind by a vanished civilization? Probably not. And I am not going to insult you by pretending the wildest version is confirmed. Let me give you the grounded explanation, because it is still extraordinary. The cavities are real. The seismic data is real and peer-reviewed. But when Scotia's own people looked closely at the left paw anomaly, they had to acknowledge a sobering possibility. The limestone of the Giza Plateau is soft, fractured, riddled with natural faults and cleavage planes. Bad limestone returns confusing echoes. It can produce multiple reflections that look, on a graph, deceptively like the walls of a room. Some of what reads as a chamber may be nothing more than the rock itself being broken in regular ways. And the water erosion, the critics point out, could, in theory, come from Nile flooding and the occasional heavy rains that did still fall, rarely, into the dynastic period. Mark Lehner, one of the most respected scholars of the Giza Plateau, argues there is simply no room in the archaeological sequence for an older builder, because the limestone cut from the Sphinx's pit was used to build the temple right next to it, tying them to the same era. That is the careful, mainstream case, and it deserves to be on the table. But here is what that case does not erase. It does not erase the vertical erosion, which still looks far more like rain than like wind, and which no Egyptologist has ever explained with actual geology, rather than a dismissive sentence. It does not erase the fact that the chamber under the paw has never been opened, even with non-invasive tools that could settle the argument in an afternoon. It does not erase the L-shaped anomaly in the cemetery, or the network of cavities confirmed by multiple independent teams across 40 years. And it does not explain why a monument with no inscription, dated by a guess, sitting on ground that records a flood of vanished time, is one of the most restricted scientific sites on the planet. Even the grounded version leaves you with a statue that is older than it should be, hollow underneath in ways nobody planned for, and locked. So let me tell you what it would mean if the bold version is even partly true, because this is where the whole picture tilts. If the body of the Sphinx was carved between 7,000 and 10,000 BCE, then somebody was conducting monumental engineering during a period when, according to everything we are taught, humans were scattered hunters with no cities, no writing, and no organized labor. Carving the largest statue on Earth out of a single ridge of bedrock is not a casual act. It requires planning, mathematics, a workforce, tools capable of shaping stone with precision. It requires a civilization, an organized, technical, capable civilization thousands of years before the first one we have a name for. And that is the lost technology in the title. It is not a glowing device in a sealed vault, though maybe that is down there too. The real lost technology is the knowledge itself, the ability to move and carve stone on that scale, to survey, to plan a structure that would outlast every empire that came after. Whoever carved the original Sphinx had that ability, and then they were gone so completely that the Egyptians who inherited the monument may not have built it at all. They may have found it. A weathered lion, half buried in sand, already ancient when their civilization began. They recarved the head, possibly, which is why the head looks too small for the body, why it is in far better condition, why it does not match. They adopted a relic from a culture they did not remember and made it their own. If that is true, then our history is missing a chapter. An entire chapter. A people advanced enough to carve mountains, who lived before the flood of meltwater that ended the last ice age, raised the seas, and drowned the coastlines where the rest of their world may still lie. The Sphinx, in that version, is not the beginning of Egyptian civilization. It is a tombstone for a forgotten one, and it would not stand alone. Think about what else sits at the edges of accepted history. Stone circles in Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, carved and then deliberately buried more than 11,000 years ago, by people who were not supposed to have the organization to build anything at all. Underwater structures off coastlines that were dry land before the seas rose. Megalithic blocks weighing hundreds of tons, moved and fitted with a precision we would struggle to match today. Each one, on its own, gets explained away. But line them up next to a sphinx that the rain dated to the same lost window, and a pattern starts to form. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A recurring fingerprint of skill, scattered across the world, all pointing back to a time we were told was empty. That is what makes the sealed chamber matter so much. It is not just a room under a statue. It is potentially the one place on Earth where the proof is still intact, still protected, still waiting under the most recognizable monument humanity ever made. Whatever is in that void, if it is anything at all, it has been sealed since before the pyramids. Untouched, undisturbed. A time capsule from the missing chapter, sitting 25 feet down, under the left paw, behind a door that has been measured but never opened. Here is the question that keeps me up. We have the scans, we have the void, we have had, for over 30 years, the exact tools needed to look inside without harming a single grain of that fragile limestone. Ground radar, seismic imaging, fiber optic borescopes, thinner than a pencil, that could be slipped through a hairline gap to film the inside of a sealed room without widening it by a millimeter. So the question is not, can we open it? We can. We have been able to for a generation. The question is why, after all this time, after every team, every survey, every confirmation, has no one been allowed to? What does the most studied monument on Earth still have left to hide? And who decided that the rest of us are not allowed to know? The Sphinx is still there. It has watched empires rise and collapse and turn to dust, and it has outlasted every one of them. The Romans cleared the sand from its shoulders. Napoleon's men measured its face. Tourists have leaned against its paws for 200 years without ever knowing what lay a few feet beneath their shoes. It can afford to wait. The chamber is still sealed. The radar still shows the shape, and the answer is still buried under the paw of a lion that may be twice as old as the people we credit with building it, waiting in the dark for a door that no one will open. If this rewired how you think about Giza, watch the next investigation on screen now, because the deeper you dig into the ancient world, the more you realize how much of it was never finished being uncovered. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next time a chamber like this one gets opened, you are going to want to hear it here first.